Stalag Luft III, German-occupied Poland, spring 1942. A Red Cross parcel arrives at the gates of one of the Reich's most secure prisoner-of-war camps. Inside, past the tins of corned beef and the bars of chocolate, sits a cheerful cardboard box decorated with top hats and iron pieces and the familiar promise of Mayfair and Park Lane. It is, to any casual observer, a perfectly ordinary copy of Monopoly, a British pastime, a harmless distraction for men who have nothing left to do but wait. The German guard turns it over in his hands, shakes it once, and waves it through. He has no idea what he is holding. None of them do, because this particular copy of Monopoly, and hundreds of others like it, is not a game at all. Hidden within its carefully constructed box is a silk map of Europe, a tiny compass no larger than a shirt button, real German currency pressed between the playing cards, and a set of forged identity documents tucked beneath the board itself. The British government has just smuggled an entire escape kit into the heart of the Third Reich, and they have done it by hiding it inside one of the most beloved board games in the country. This is the story of how a nation under siege turned to Whimsy as a weapon, and why, 60 years later, it remains one of the most audacious acts of wartime ingenuity ever committed. By the summer of 1941, the number of British and Commonwealth prisoners of war held in German camps had grown to a figure that confounded easy comprehension. Tens of thousands of servicemen, airmen shot down over occupied Europe, soldiers captured at Dunkirk and in North Africa, sailors pulled from the wreckage of sunken vessels, found themselves behind wire, under guard, in a network of camps that stretched from Norway to the edge of the Eastern Front. The Geneva Convention technically protected them from the worst forms of mistreatment, but it offered no comfort against the slow erosion of purpose. These were fighting men, trained and capable, sitting idle while the war continued without them. The British military establishment had, from the earliest days of the conflict, taken a rather unorthodox view of this situation. An escaped prisoner of war, the thinking went, was not merely a freed man. He was a strategic asset. Every German soldier required to guard a camp was a soldier not fighting at the front. Every manhunt launched to recapture an escapee tied up resources, disrupted railway timetables, and spread anxiety through the occupied territories. The War Office had, by 1939, established a secretive department known officially as MI9, whose sole purpose was to facilitate the escape of Allied prisoners and the return of downed airmen. Its officers understood the mathematics with cold clarity. Even failed escape attempts were useful because they consumed German attention. Successful ones were better still. The problem was material. A man who wished to escape from a German camp required, at minimum, a map of the surrounding region, a compass to navigate by, local currency to purchase food or passage, and documents that might convince a suspicious policeman he was, in fact, a Belgian electrician or a French labourer. Obtaining any of these items within a camp was extraordinarily difficult. Compasses could be fashioned from magnetized needles, but they were crude and often useless. Paper maps disintegrated in rain within hours. Currency could occasionally be bribed from sympathetic guards, but only at enormous personal risk. The problem, in short, was one of supply. How do you get an escape kit into a prisoner of war camp when every parcel arriving from outside is opened, examined, prodded, and often confiscated by men who are specifically trained to look for exactly this sort of thing? The answer came, as the best British answers often do, from an institution that combined eccentricity with exceptional competence. Christopher Clayton Hutton, known universally as Clutty, To the colleagues who simultaneously admired and despaired of him was a former Royal Flying Corps officer, a publicist, and a man whose relationship with conventional thinking was, at best, strained. He had joined MY9 in 1939 and was given an office, a modest budget, and instructions so vague as to be almost liberating. Devise methods by which prisoners of war might be helped to escape. He took to the task with the enthusiasm of a man who had been waiting his entire professional life for someone to officially sanction his more unusual ideas. Hutton's genius was partly technical and partly psychological. He understood that the German guards searching incoming parcels were not stupid. They were, in fact, well-trained and often experienced. What they were looking for, however, was specifically the thing that looked like contraband: a metal file hidden in a loaf of bread, a compass stitched into the lining of a coat. What they were not, on the whole, looking for was the thing that looked entirely innocent. Hutton's great insight was concealment through normalcy. Don't disguise the escape kit as something else. Disguise it as something so ordinary, so expected, so utterly British, that no one would think twice about waving it through. He turned first to silk. Traditional paper maps were useless to an escaping prisoner. They made noise when unfolded in the dark. They disintegrated when wet. And they were instantly recognizable as maps to anyone who happened to be searching a fugitive. Silk maps made no noise. They did not disintegrate. They could be folded to the size of a postage stamp, concealed inside a coat lining, or swallowed in an emergency. The John Waddington Company, then based in Leeds and better known to the British public as the manufacturer and licensee of Monopoly, was recruited for the task. Waddingtons had, since the early part of the century, developed considerable expertise in printing on unusual materials. Their silk maps, produced under conditions of absolute secrecy in a cordoned-off section of the factory, were extraordinarily precise. A single map measuring roughly 20 centimeters by 30 centimeters could depict an entire region of Europe in enough detail to be genuinely useful to a man navigating on foot. The compasses were equally ingenious. Miniaturized to approximately 1 centimeter in diameter, roughly the size of a shirt button, which is precisely what many of them were. They were manufactured by a variety of firms working under contract to MI9. Some were magnetized needles hidden inside pencil stubs. Others were worked into the back of collar studs or the tips of cricket bats. The specific genius of the Monopoly compasses was that they were hidden inside the small, round playing pieces, the top hat, the iron, the boot, where they were all but invisible to a casual search and entirely indistinguishable from the original metalwork. Currency was the most delicate element. Real German Reichsmarks and occupied territory notes were pressed between the cards of the chance and community chess decks, sized to match the playing cards exactly, forged identity documents. Some of the most meticulously reproduced forgeries produced during the entire war were printed on paper concealed beneath the playing board itself, which lifted away from the base of the box along a seam so precise that it required deliberate knowledge of its existence to find. The overall production numbers remain uncertain. Records were destroyed at the end of the war, either by design or by the chaotic destruction of the final months. But estimates suggest that somewhere in the region of 1,000 specially adapted game sets were produced, along with substantial quantities of other games, playing card sets, and toys equipped with similar concealed materials. The distribution mechanism was itself a work of careful deception. The International Red Cross, which had a legal right under the Geneva Convention to supply prisoners with recreational materials and food parcels, was not directly involved in and indeed was not informed of, the use of their supply chain for intelligence purposes. MI9 instead worked through a network of fictitious charitable organizations, created specifically for the purpose, whose names appeared legitimate, but whose entire output was produced under government direction. The most prominent of these was the Licensed Victualers Prisoner of War Relief Fund, a name so magnificently dull that no one thought to question it. Parcels distributed through these organizations were carefully coded on their exterior packaging so that prisoners who had been briefed, usually senior officers who had received instructions before capture, would know which parcels to open with particular care. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. And there is rather a lot more where this came from. The German authorities were, it must be said, not entirely ignorant of Allied attempts to smuggle contraband into camps. The Abwehr, the German military intelligence service, maintained dedicated counterintelligence units whose specific responsibility was the analysis of incoming prisoner parcels. They were well aware that the British were attempting to supply escapees, and they found and confiscated a considerable quantity of contraband over the course of the war. What they consistently failed to achieve was the systematic identification of the game-based concealment method. This was partly a function of volume. The number of parcels arriving at German camps was enormous, and partly a function of Hutton's central insight about concealment through familiarity. The Americans, when they entered the war in 1941 and began producing their own equivalent of MI9's escape materials, largely adopted the British approach, including the use of silk maps and miniaturized compasses. They did not, on the whole, use the monopoly distribution method, partly because monopoly was less culturally ubiquitous in the United States at that time, and partly because American supply chains into German camps were organized differently. The British approach was, in this specific respect, uniquely suited to British cultural geography. A board game that would have aroused suspicion in an American context was, in a British one, entirely invisible. No equivalent German program for supplying their own prisoners in Allied camps with similar materials has been documented, though this may reflect gaps in the historical record rather than an absence of effort. The Japanese equivalent was, by most accounts, considerably less sophisticated, relying on direct material support where it existed at all rather than concealment-based methods. The British operation stands, in the historiography of wartime intelligence, as an exceptional case of creative problem-solving applied to a logistical challenge, the kind of achievement that is easy to admire in retrospect and must have been genuinely extraordinary to conceive in the conditions of 1940 and 1941. The precise number of successful escapes attributable to MI9's escape kits, including those distributed via Monopoly and other games, is difficult to establish with confidence. The organization's own post-war accounting credited its various programs with contributing to the successful return of somewhere between 35,000 and 40,000 Allied personnel over the course of the war. Not all of these escapes involved game-based concealment. Many relied on other distribution methods, or on kits that had been manufactured into uniform linings and boot soles before capture. But the game-based kits were consistently identified by returned escapees as among the most practically useful materials they received. The psychological impact was perhaps as significant as the material one. Men confined in camps with no prospect of imminent liberation found, in the knowledge that someone on the outside was thinking creatively on their behalf, a sustaining sense of connection to the broader war effort. The Monopoly kits were not merely useful. They were, in a very real sense, a message from home. Someone clever and determined had looked at the problem of a prisoner sitting behind wire and had thought, what can we put in a board game? The absurdity of that question and the brilliance of its answer communicated something important about the national character that formal military communiques could not.